I'll just give you a bit of background to how the webinar is going to run. We've got 3 excellent speakers who will speak for around 15 to 20 minutes each. And following that, we'll have a period for questions. So you can post questions to the Q&A down the bottom of your screen. You can also post questions on Facebook, and we have a moderator who's collecting those questions. So we'll try and keep to time. I'd like to welcome everybody and acknowledge that we're meeting on July 4, which is a significant date in the American calendar. And for some of us, it's been a date that we've protested against the US in Australia over many decades. We were colonised by the British in 1788, Invasion Day, as our Aboriginal brothers and sisters refer to it. And from that moment, we were a colony of the British Empire. And then following the period between the First and Second World War, the Americans began to make themselves more of the presence in Australia at that time. And we have very clearly been almost a colony of the United States since the Second World War. Most of our large companies, certainly our mining industry, and most of our assets are not owned in this country. And that's been the case for, you know, most of our lives. We noticed recently that our Morrison government has just announced yet another large slice of the budget going to the American US Australian alliance in the form of arrangements around ownership of our ports, visits by US Marines in Darwin, which we see on a regular basis now, and obviously arrangements around defence arrangements with the US to tie us even closer to the United States. We are spending a huge amount of money that should in fact be spent on Australian lives and for Australian benefit, not as some outpost of the United States in the Pacific. We have first up an excellent speaker, Professor Clinton Fernandes. He's from UNSW in Canberra, author of Island Off the Coast of Asia and What Uncle Sam Wants. Clinton studies the future operational environment that Australia's military will face in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe. He examines the use of emerging technologies in human performance enhancement, bioengineering, nanotechnologies, and advanced materials and manufacturing methods. I'd like to introduce Professor Clinton Fernandes as our first speaker. Thank you, Clinton.
Thank you. Am I on? I need to share my PowerPoint presentation, please.
Okay.
How's that?
Yes, that's looking good, Clinton.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for inviting me. Since today's the 4th of July, and we are in fact talking about something that happened more than 200 years ago, I thought a historically informed presentation might be of assistance. And so we'll go back to the 4th of July, 1776, when the 13 colonies declared independence. And I want to take a book, a very important book, that was written, published at the same time by Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. And book 2, chapter 5, is on comparative advantage. Now, Smith was, in a sense, pre-capitalist. The theory of comparative advantage was refined and developed by David Ricardo later on. But the key points from Adam Smith in that particular section, these are almost verbatim quotes. Our American colonies, he says, have hitherto been employed in agriculture. They don't manufacture anything. And what he says is that's exactly what they should be doing. They shouldn't be trying to modernize and manufacture things. They should continue to be an agricultural country, producing raw materials so that English industries can benefit. But this is also the way that American society can benefit, because that's their comparative advantage. And he says that if they were to stop importing European manufactured goods and allow their own countrymen to monopolize manufacturing within their own borders, then that would obstruct their own wealth and greatness. Same with exporting, the carrying trade from continental United States to, say, Europe or anywhere else. And so that was the best advice, the best economic advice given by perhaps the most important economist of his generation. And he's been influential ever since. Now, when the United States was able to declare independence and a few years later defeat the British at Yorktown, they were able to disregard this advice. If they'd followed the advice, they'd still only be producing agriculture and maybe exporting a few furs and buffalo skins. They wouldn't actually have an advanced manufacturing industry. It's only because they declared independence and were able to fight and win independence that they could disregard comparative advantage theory and develop their country. There were other countries at the time that were unable to do this because they were unable to declare independence. Cotton was the engine of the American Industrial Revolution, in much the same way that oil has been the engine of the 20th century Industrial Revolution and the core of the manufacturing economy. Cotton was the principal element. Egypt had both water and cotton, but it was unable to develop because it couldn't shake off European imperial power. And so it remained in the third world, whereas the United States did not. And the core point there is that an independent United States could control the pace of its integration into the global economy, the breadth of its integration, and also the depth of its integration. True independence isn't about changing a flag or about who becomes the monarch or whether we have an Australian head of state or not. But rather it's about whether you're able to control or have a better degree of control as to the depth, breadth, and pace of your country's integration into the global economy. The US could do that on the 4th of July, and it's worth celebrating for that reason. I should add, of course, that the United States, the 13 colonies, did not do it by themselves. Washington had 8,000 men under arms at any given time. The total population was 300,000 able-bodied men, and Washington only had 8,000 men. But the French provided 44,000 men. And that's why the United States, the 13 colonies, were able to defeat the British. That cost the French about $2 billion, which bankrupted the French treasury and precipitated the French Revolution later on. But the fact is the United States was independent and was able to do all these things with the assistance of the French. Now, with that in mind, the proposition I wish to put forward is that we are a sub-imperial power. We are not an exploited colony and haven't been an exploited colony of the British, but rather we are a sub-imperial power. We uphold the overall imperial system, participating in it enthusiastically overseas, but we are primarily responsible for it in our own region. Now, this results in a wealthy economy, but a dependent one. Our export profile is very much similar to what a third world country's export profile is. Principally raw materials like iron ore, coal, gold, petroleum, gas, and so on. We have tourism, of course, but that once again is what a third world country might do. There is an indicator here on economic complexity, and we have the lowest economic complexity of all the advanced industrial countries, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Countries, the OECD. Our economic complexity is comparable to the economies of Kazakhstan Kenya and Saudi Arabia, and they basically export oil. Sorry, not Kenya, of course, but Saudi Arabia. It also means that just as British investors in the past were dominant in the Australian economy, today American-based investors are dominant in our economy. Now, I'm going to show in the next slide some data from the stock exchange based on the Bloomberg Professional Terminal. And I want to acknowledge here that this is by no means a complete study because it doesn't take into account things like private equity or other privately held companies. But in the publicly traded realm, we see here that the dark green section here is where American-based investors, for the most part, they outnumber the percentage of Australian-based investors. So the Commonwealth Bank of Australia is only about 22% Australian-owned. Something like BHP Billiton is less than 10% Australian-owned. It's about 70% American-owned. If you look at the big banks, Westpac, National Australia Bank, ANZ Bank, Woolies, Wesfarmers, Macquarie Group, Rio Tinto, Woodside Petroleum, Goodman Group, Centre Group, Brambles, Westfield, Newcrest Mining. These data, the data informing that slide comes from a May 2019 report, which I did through the Bloomberg Professional Terminal. I looked at it recently. The proportion of US investment has actually increased in Australia during the coronavirus crisis. And therefore, I haven't brought that data in because I don't want to skew the argument in my favor at an unusual time. This is the normal pattern, however, is that approximately 16 of the top 20 companies in our stock exchange are actually owned by American-based investors. Now, if you own the equity in a company, you're responsible for and you have control over the kinds of policies, priorities that the company is responsible for. And so American-based investors speak with a very loud voice in the Australian Stock Exchange. This fact is not always known. Now, people might object to the term imperialism or sub-imperialism when I'm referring to Australian policy. And so I just want to clarify the term. There are all kinds of doctrinal ways of discussing it, and there are entire books and PhD theses on exactly what imperialism is. I just prefer a much more simple, even if it's simplistic definition, which is that it's just the control, indirect or direct, of one group over some other group, nation over another nation. The big difference between modern control, hegemony, or imperialism with previous imperialist or previous empires is, as you see on the slide. If Alexander the Great were in Afghanistan today, he wouldn't be surprised at all by Taliban tactics or by Western tactics. I mean, he'd be very surprised by drones and satellites and stuff like that, but certainly not when it comes to patrolling. But his strategy was, to marry his generals to Afghan princesses. The Australian Defence Force, of course, can't adopt such a strategy. But the point was that the peasants would continue to produce the same foodstuffs and handicrafts in the same way. It didn't transform the society that you were conquering. Yes. It's just that the direction in which that surplus went was different. It went to a foreign ruling group instead of a domestic ruling group because it involved exploitation but no real economic and social changes. But because capitalism is a dynamic system, then capitalist imperialism transforms the conquered territories because of the imperial center's technical power and its economic power and its political power. It utterly transforms the conquered territories. And to give you a sense of how this works, if you look at Australia as a sub-imperial power, Australia transferred wealth from its, Britain transferred wealth from its conquered territories to the settled colonies where British settlers had gone, and they supported industrial growth in the center. So from 1765 to 1914, Britain drained about 9.2 trillion pounds in today's money from India. That's 45 trillion US dollars. And 45% of the British foreign investment, which came out of those colonies, flowed to North America, principally Canada, and Australia and New Zealand. The reason Bangladesh is poor, in a sense, is that Australia is rich, and vice versa. The largest recipients of British foreign investments in the 1870s and 1880s were the Australian colonies, the 6 colonies. And so one can't actually say that Australia suffered as a result of being a sub-imperial power. It is not convincing at all to say that Australia was exploited by the British, or that in some way Australia did not benefit from British imperialism. In fact, it was a favored colony and was the junior partner of the British Empire. And so this was understood by leaders, intellectuals, and so on at the time. The word empire has now gone out of fashion. There's all kinds of objections to that term, but people were more honest at that time. And so Alfred Deakin says that India was won by the sword, is still held by the sword, and can only be retained by the sword. And it was an honest statement. And I'm referring here to India simply because that's where the most work has been done by Indian economists. But there is plenty of other work that has been and is being done in the other colonies. And so the drain of wealth away from those colonies into the settled colonies is the entire basis of the wealth of those settled colonies. And the same thing might be said of, say, France and other imperial powers. Now, it's very interesting to look at the way in which liberal intellectuals supported empire. They genuinely believed it was a force for good, because belief systems are contingent on the goals desired. If you want to see the empire, then you construct a system of beliefs that provides you with the intellectual support. So here is John Stuart Mill, in many ways an admirable figure, an early feminist, and known today for his defense of free speech and other core tenets of liberalism. And here he says, Britain is not a selfish imperial power. It acts in the service of other countries, not itself. It's just that these barbarians are forcing it to bear the costs of war. But it still shares its fruits with the whole human race. And such a country is a novelty in the world, so much so that people are unable to believe it when they see it. That's John Stuart Mill, great intellectual, genuinely important figure. If you replace Britain with USA or France or China, and you look at their intellectuals defending their own societies, you're going to find very similar justifications, very, very similar justifications. John Stuart Mill was writing in 1859, which is immediately after the crushing of the Indian Mutiny/Rebellion. And as Britain was getting ready to continue to push more and more opium into China, Indian opium, I would add. There are Indian families that got very rich on the basis of Indian opium that went to China. And so it doesn't make sense to say that Australia somehow suffered when all this was going on. We were not exploited when this was happening. And the phrase imperium in imperial was used by one of the key thinkers of Australian foreign policy on the eve of the First World War. Fred Eggleston says that nations, like people, have often to face a great crisis before their raison d'etre becomes revealed to the world. And so he says that this imperium, this empire within a bigger empire, has been established by our Australian possessions in the Pacific. So the Southwest Pacific is the place where we have our own little empire, where we can push other countries around, like, say, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and of course, more recently, Timor-Leste, with espionage and bullying and so on. But you'll find, once again, the same justifications, that it's really external threats that are forcing countries to behave, that are forcing us to behave in such a way, but really our intentions are very benign. And I would add, Chinese intellectuals who defend Chinese policy in places like, say, Xinjiang or Tibet would adopt pretty much the same justification for their country's behavior. This isn't to say that everyone's acting in an identical manner, but rather the intellectual support is there. Now, here is public opinion by Ian McAllister in Australia towards defense and security. This is why today there is consistent and overwhelming support for the ANZUS alliance. It doesn't make sense to say that Australia has actually suffered. Yes, there are things we are being held back in a certain way. We can't diversify, we can't complexify the economy, we can't control certain things. And we do participate in expeditionary wars to uphold the overall American system, American-led system. But the public does have support for ANZUS, and any changes, McAllister says, are evident only in their intensity, not their direction. And for most Australians, ANZUS remains central. So those who want to argue about the topic of this particular forum have a lot of work to do, and they have to come up with real reasons as to why Australia should break away if indeed it should. My goal here is simply to lay it out and to inform rather than to persuade. With that in mind, I want to look at one of the most interesting PhD theses over the last 10 years by Dr. Caroline Yarnell. It's called, "Is the Australian Public Rational on Foreign Policy Issues?" I'm going to explain what she means by the term rational in the next slide. But if you look at the importance of ANZUS, I've copied from that PhD thesis. I was the beneficiary of her generosity. She gave me a copy of her thesis. It doesn't drop below 80%. I mean, it's almost 80%. There is huge support for ANZUS. Part of the reason for this is that the last time Australian forces faced an enemy in a high-intensity conflict was in the Korean War in the 1950s. The last Australian to be killed by enemy air power was in 1943 in Salamaua in the New Guinea campaign. There haven't been a steady stream of casualties against a credible adversary that can defend itself. And as a result, participation in an American-led expeditionary war has not actually caused that much of a cost compared to some of the benefits that are gained by the wealth extraction from the rest of the world. What Dr. Yarnell finds in her thesis is that Australian public opinion on foreign policy issues is durable over time. It is not set in stone. It is, in fact, responsive to triggers such as changes in the environment, major events, and so on. And it is consistent and coherent, and it shows a degree of structure and discernment. The thesis has not been summarized or published in an easily accessible form to the average reader. But the value of this is that it shows that the Australian public is open to being influenced by arguments, but more importantly by events on foreign policy issues. Here's another example from the Lowy Institute's opinion poll, that there's a slight majority that favors stronger relations with the United States, even if it might harm relations with China. Now that's 2019. Anyone who is interested in trying to convince the Australian public cannot somehow dismiss all these polls as simply based on propaganda or whatnot. This is the terrain on which any argument has to be made. These polls have to be studied and understood and analyzed. There is a change in the answer to a certain question from 2013 to 2020, that we should act to support US military action in Asia, for example, in a conflict between China and Taiwan. The proportion of strongly disagree and somewhat disagree is, let's say about 60% to 63%, but it's basically stable. It remains to be seen what happens as a result of further developments in the defense and foreign affairs space. the importance of Australia's relationship with the United States versus that with China was starting to get equalized around 2016, but then the divergence has now changed. And that the public is not, they might be information poor, but they are responding coherently and consistently to triggers in the environment. Here's one. And this is the basis on which any campaign about granting asylum to Hong Kong people or fighting in the South China Sea will be defended. The public was asked in this poll, the black bar is 2020, of course, that if there's a clash between our economic interests and our democratic values, whatever that means, what's more important? And now our democratic values are believed to be more important than our economic interests. Although there has been a change, it still means that the public is open to being convinced by a barrage of media commentary, government commentary, statements by ministers and so on, that we have to defend democracy or a free and open trading environment in the South China Sea, and we can't allow an authoritarian state like China to dictate our economic interests. That point was made quite repeatedly by the Prime Minister, and you can expect that that opinion poll question about values versus interests to respond coherently and in a predictable manner as a result of the major communications that are coming out of the government and the media. Well, if there is to be any kind of cost of Australian imperialism, so far the cost has not been borne by society as a whole, at least about the war. There have been diggers who've come back broken, they've been killed in action, wounded, but there hasn't really been a price for fighting, say, in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else, not for many years. But Australian sub-imperialism, one of the strategic level costs or features is you have to be deeply integrated into American warfighting machinery. I'm going to pick up on two major installations, the joint defense facilities at Pine Gap and the Northwest Cape. This is in the Exmouth, in the town of Exmouth, the Harold Holt Naval Communications Station. These are installations. Pine Gap is the ground control station for a chain of satellites, which allow targeting, and it wraps Australia fully into the US warfighting machinery. And the Naval Communications Station at Northwest Cape allows the United States to send firing messages to its hunter-killer submarines at the start of any conflict, allowing them to target Chinese submarines without needing to check or clear anything with Australia. And so what Australia says is, our policy is this is occurring with full knowledge and concurrence. There are ministerial statements explaining what it means, that we have full knowledge and concurrence of the capacity in those joint defense facilities. We're not approving every single operation that occurs, and that's not the role that's not the meaning of full knowledge and concurrence. Rather, these installations have a certain military capability, and we have full knowledge and concurrence of the capability, rather than on a particular targeting of some militant in Yemen or anywhere else. We're not approving individual strikes, but rather the capacity to do that. That's what full knowledge and concurrence means. But we are integrated fully as part of Australian sub-imperialism into the American warfighting machine. And to that end, I want to pick up on something that came up a few days ago. The one on the right, at least the right on my screen, is our country's Defense and Strategic Update 2020. It was announced by the Defense and Minister and Foreign Minister and Prime Minister, a few days ago. But it bears a striking resemblance to certain concepts in the Pentagon's Indo-Pacific Strategy Report 12 months ago. It is a sub-imperial document that fits into the Pentagon's Indo-Pacific strategy. The Pentagon is quite explicit about labeling China as a revisionist power, which undermines the international system from within, militarizes the South China Sea, employs non-military tools coercively, works in the gray zone, which is actions short of military, overt military actions. And it conducts all these complex operations in cyberspace, space, and electronic warfare. Defense update, the Australian defense update is not quite so accusatory. It is much, it only mentions China 9 times. And it doesn't use the term revisionist power. It refers mostly to the active pursuit and its strategic competition. And it talks about gray zone activities, but doesn't mention China. And it talks about militarization of the South China Sea, doesn't mention China in that. And so it tries to not point the finger, but in fact, the concepts that it uses and the defense acquisitions that it envisages are designed to integrate the Australian Defence Force into any military action that will occur in the South China Sea. All the slides, all the sources of what I've said are in that book. Now, here is what this is from Alfred McCoy's article in the Journal of Asian Studies. This is what the South China Sea looks like. The size, by the way, is 3.5 million square kilometers. That means it is the size of Western Australia and South Australia combined. That's the size of the South China Sea. It has unique acoustic features for submarines. There's a shallow continental shelf. It's not very deep. But China is able to project force within the South China Sea. It's got anti-aircraft batteries that are tuned in to the radar installations in the artificial islands it's been constructing. And other countries such as the United States or Japan or the Philippines. When I say Japan, I mean the American fleet that's in Japan, or the Philippine or the American fleet that's in the Philippines or in Guam, or in fact the Royal Australian Naval Base that's there in Darwin. It takes quite a while to get there. And so part of the defense acquisition is designed to increase the force projection power. It's said as defense, but in fact it is power projection. And if you look at the South China Sea there, I'd like you to take a closer look at the right-hand side of that slide in Subic Bay in the Philippines. Subic Bay, it's about, the size of that is the size of the entire state of Singapore. It's a very large base in Subic Bay, a US military base. You've got to get on a helicopter to get from one side of the base to the other. And if you're looking at, say, Japan, it's actually Sasebo, which is near Fukuoka on the southwestern side. Nevertheless, the whole point of the defense update is to join the United States and to fit into the Indo-Pacific strategy report of 2019 in order to project force into those areas. I think I'll end there, and perhaps we can take questions when the other speakers have finished.
Thank you very much, Clinton. People keep their questions to the end. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Margaret Beavis. Margaret is a Melbourne GP who joined the Medical Association for Prevention of War after recognising the huge, often preventable, sorry, the light is just changing as the sun's changing at the moment, loss of life and environmental devastation caused by warfare. Her interests include the creeping militarisation of Australia, nuclear issues, climate change, and the undue influences affecting political decision-making in Australia. She is your She is Vice President of Medical Association for the Prevention of War, co-chair of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons in Australia, and a director of Quit Nuclear campaign for nuclear disarmament and weapons-free Australia. Thank you. I welcome you, Margaret.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners, and before starting, acknowledge that this land was never ceded, that if you're a First Nations person who's a man, you're more than 15 times more likely to be in jail. If you're a female, you're more than 20 times more likely to be in jail, and overall, you're 10 times more likely to die in custody than if you're a white person. And I think this underpins a whole lot of measures that need to be taken, that need to be Indigenous-centred to rectify this appalling breach of human rights. So, talking about joining American wars and Australian militarism, and what are the costs of us not having an independent foreign policy. So I'm going to look at the costs from a number of ways, both the monetary costs and the other costs. I'm going to look at what the options are, what else we could spend our money on. I'm going to touch briefly on what are the underlying contributors and also what we should be aiming for. So firstly, just to go on the money, America's been urging Australia for many years to take its defence budget up to 2%, and we will next year. 2% doesn't sound very much, 2% of GDP, but what you have to realise is that in actual terms of money coming into the government, less than a quarter of a GDP comes into the government in terms of tax income. So when you look at the actual numbers from 2019-2020, we didn't spend 2% on our military, we spent 7.4% of our disposable income on the military. I'm just going to screen share for a moment, so bear with me for a second. Okay, so what's even more shocking is that if you look at the American discretionary budget, so when I'm talking about the discretionary budget, I'm talking about all the income to the federal government, then you take away the interest payment on the US debt, you take away the commitments to pensions, and you find that the US spends more than 60% of its total discretionary budget on the military. This is more than 10 times what they spend on health, more than 10 times what they spend on education, more than 10 times what they spend on community housing. As a result, the United States is a disproportionately enormous military centre and enormous military manufacturing. If you take the next 7 highest countries, you find that they're still not adding up to the United States is still a bigger budget. China is about a third the military budget of the United States currently. This is a slide some of you may have seen before. It's one of my favourite slides. Unfortunately, SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, has not updated it. But basically, it compares military spending with sustainable development goals. And basically what it shows is if you were to spend 1/5, so about 20–21% of global military spending, you would be able to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger globally, provide basic health care and clean water and sanitation. If you added to that another 12%, that would be 1/3 of global military expenditure. You would also be able to provide universal basic education. So really, our current global military spending is damaging many, many, many people. This is the latest document on Australia's military spend, and as you can see, it continues to ramp up. I think it works out at about 6% a year. Now, you think about the austerity that's being inflicted on many other parts of the budget, most notably currently the ABC, which is an institution that tends to hold the government to account. So it did.
Oh no. Margaret, we've stopped hearing you.
finish it maybe in an hour or less. If there'll be question and answers, yes.
Margaret?
Margaret seems to have dropped out. Can George do something?
Actually, I cannot. She has audio on, but we cannot hear her. So I'm sorry. It's her end, not ours.
Okay.
Chat. Let's see the chat. What is in the chat? We can't hear you. Can facilitator unmute. She's not muted anyway.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll go back to the screen share. Just quickly, if I fall out again, I will try and rejoin later. I'll just keep going. Please tell me if you can't hear me.
Yes, thank you, Margie.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Okay, so we're talking about this slide, which is from the document that came out this week, showing that 575 billion over the next decade is going to be spent. I find these numbers really hard because they're such big numbers. So I'm just going to illustrate what just 5 billion, so less than a hundredth of what they're spending in the next decade. So 5 billion will buy you 100 new schools, 3,500 teachers, 3 new regional hospitals. It will buy you nurses and doctors to staff these hospitals, 200 fire and rescue vehicles, 800 police officers, and you would still have $220 million to share. And that was calculated in 2019. So really 5 billion goes an awfully long way, and we're planning to spend more than 100 times that on our defence. Foreign aid, Australia has, again, as well as cutting independent media, we've shamefully cut our foreign aid, which is really terrible because it's not only improved the lives of millions, but it's also helped stabilise the region and prevent conflict. So this is what our foreign aid budget looks like. Shamefully, it's well below 0.7, which is the OECD recommended level, and is now heading for 0.2%. It's worth reflecting that England, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, he said he was not going to make cuts on the back of the world's poorest. So at the height of when Britain was going its most austerity, its greatest austerity, Gordon Brown legislated in long-term 0.7% of gross national income to go on foreign aid. And Australia should be ashamed that we're cutting our foreign aid so greatly. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I'd now like to go back to, sorry, I'm just getting my screen set up again. Can you hear me again?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, if I get cut out, I'll lose my screen again. But okay, so in terms of spending priorities, this is what the cost of war is costing us. We need to realize that there's not just the financial impacts, but there's also human impacts on health and society, both in the country that we have gone to war with the US on, and also on the Australian society ourselves. And also it impacts on our alliances and has knock-on effects where you destabilize a region. I'm going to give you an example of the Vietnam War. 521 Australians died, 3,000 were physically wounded, and many more were mentally impacted with post-traumatic stress, moral injury, and the rates of drug and alcohol abuse in these veterans was enormous. In Vietnam, more than 2 million Vietnamese civilians died. 1.1 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters died. There were enormous environmental impacts. Agent Orange was only a small part of it. And there was regional destabilization, and many experts believe that the terrible outcomes in Cambodia were as a result of the regional destabilization that began in Vietnam. Malcolm Fraser wrote a book called Dangerous Allies, and I recommend that people read it. He was absolutely livid when he found out that the US, in fact, knew the war was unwinnable at the time that they asked Australia to massively ramp up its troop contribution. The CIA knew it was unwinnable, and yet they still, for the sake of political pressures in America, encouraged Australia to send its soldiers. I'm also going to talk about examples of the cost of war at home. In 2018, over 3 million Australians were living below the poverty line, so more than 10% of the population, including over 700,000 children. And this is much worse for single-parent households. It was especially for people on the youth allowance and for people on New Start. Similarly, legal aid has been stripped away. Even of those under the poverty line, less than 10% of them can access legal aid because the funding has been stripped. The Law Council of Australia said that hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts by successive federal governments have pushed legal aid to the brink of collapse. And the Law Council of Australia is not a radical body. Similarly, social housing. We have had 25 years of inadequate social housing. In 2016 the most recent census was in 2016. We had 116,000 homeless people. To house these people, we need to get rid of the backlog. We need 36,000 units a year. Currently, we're only building 3,000 units a year, which doesn't even keep up with the increase in demand. And ironically, to actually fund this building of 36,000 units a year would take each year $5 billion. So I'm coming back to what $5 billion can do. It's actually an absolute disgrace that the part of the support for the construction industry is going to middle-class renovators instead of going to social housing, because we have such an enormous need. Another cost of not having an independent foreign policy is that it worsens our ability to defend ourselves and makes us a target. In fact, commentators suggest the reason we need the US to defend us is because we are so enmeshed with the US. It's sort of a catch-22, really. We're well beyond interoperability. The Joint Strike Fighters, the planes, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, what they say on the box, they're Joint Strike Fighters. They're not designed for defense. They're designed for joining the US to strike. They are not only planes that are inordinately expensive, very delayed in delivery, technically very flawed, but also the American Air Force has admitted that you need, because they are so slow in flight compared to other fighter jets, they need to be protected by the F-22 Raptors. In other words, the F-35s have to fly with the F-22 Raptors to help them not be shot out of the sky. But the US will not sell us F-22 Raptors. We just have the F-35. We have the US troops in Darwin, which certainly makes us a target. We have senior military personnel in the US chain of command in the Pacific. In the US chain of command in the Pacific, in the Army, an Australian Major General is number 2 under the US. So we are deeply enmeshed in that chain of command. We have our oil reserves in America, and it is just absurd to think that oil reserves will be shipped in the middle of a war, and it just increases our dependence. It's very depressing that this week Scott Morrison has announced purchasing land-based long-range missiles. America has wanted to put land-based long-range missiles in Australia for a very long time. The fact that we're paying for them, paying Lockheed Martin, of course, the world's biggest weapons manufacturer, an American company, makes it slightly better. But since we're so enmeshed, this is a major ramping up of aggression by Australia. And Pine Gap, as has already been mentioned, is not only we don't have sovereignty, they're co-administered, but they're certainly run by the US. They implicate us in drone strikes in other countries we are not at war in. These are extrajudicial killings with no due process, where people are killed illegally and basically a war crime, and civilians are killed in those strikes. Similarly, there's nuclear weapons targeting and a number of other problems with Pine Gap. It's worth noting that Australia has joined every US major conflict since World War II. The current US-China conflict is being beaten up by people with political agendas. There's domestic pressures in both countries that make conflict more likely, but particularly Donald Trump seems to be making it a centerpiece of his re-election strategy, and it would be a tragedy if Australia ended up going to war as part of Donald Trump's re-election strategy. Morrison seems to be increasingly caving into pressure from his right wing. I'm not sure why that is, but certainly the announcements this week are a major ramping up in the rhetoric. I think it's interesting, very interesting to Clinton to hear the history and the imperial motivations. I'm also concerned very much about the military-industrial complex, which I think is well established here in Australia and is creeping also into our commemorative space and especially into our educational space, where in tertiary and secondary education, there's many more military weapons companies providing funding, and certainly, for instance, Melbourne University is taking tens of millions of dollars from Lockheed Martin to have PhDs paid for. Other contributors in Australia, we have a political system that's not representative. We have opaque lobbying, donations, and we have think tanks like the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which was set up by the Australian government. But as the Australian government reduces its funding, this stepped into the breach, surprise, surprise, is the weapons companies and a number of anti-Chinese government agencies from overseas, for instance, Taiwan and other areas. So this is a major problem since ASPI tries to present itself as independent when in fact it's getting increasingly compromised. We have no effective independent commission against corruption. We have politicians who, for instance, the submarine decision recently was significantly influenced by the fact that there would be South Australian jobs after the closure of the car industry, and this really becomes state-level pork barrelling. I'd like to talk a little more about the jobs. In terms of jobs, when these are used to justify this huge military expenditure, when you look at jobs, if you look at the same amount of money spent on health or spent on education, you get more than double the jobs. And if you look at it spent on renewable energy, you get about nearly 1.5 times the number of jobs you do spent on military manufacture. And the other underlying contributor is I think that fear makes people more compliant. And I think given that the Eden-Monaro by-election is today, I think it's no coincidence that Scott Morrison came out with a big shiny announcement on Wednesday of something that must have been in the planning tube line for months. So I think fearful rhetoric is supposed to make people more conservative. So that's a lot of information. So what should we be aiming for? We should be aiming for increased use and funding of diplomacy, war powers reform, electoral reform, and concrete measures to protect our sovereignty and to give us independence. I think possibly unlike the other two speakers, I actually am quite fond of the ANZUS Treaty, and that will shock some of you, but I suggest you go and read it. The ANZUS Treaty is a very mild treaty that requires the parties to consult in the event of a threat to one of them, rather than automatically go to each other's assistance. And I'll read you Article 1. So Article 1 of the ANZUS Treaty says, the parties undertake, as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations, to settle any international disputes in which they may be involved by peaceful means, in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or the use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. I was astounded. A friend who knows the ANZUS Treaty well said, go and read it. And I actually, having been pretty doubtful about the ANZUS Treaty, think it's actually quite a good document, which is astounding. So I just think we need independent foreign policy rather than ditching some words that actually, if we actually did them, would be really a wonderful step forward. So I talked about diplomacy. We need to reverse the cuts to DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We need to encourage America and China to have respectful bilateral discussions, particularly around the South China Sea, and we need to involve the other nations whose sovereignty is actually being impinged upon. We need to shore up treaties, unlike Donald Trump, who's removing treaties left, right and centre, which is showing quite disdain for his allies because it makes the world a much more dangerous place. We need to support multilateral organisations like the World Health Organization. We need to work to make the United Nations a more effective place. We need to have a positive role in our region. promoting initiatives to maintain peace in the Western Pacific and join with middle powers to speak out. In terms of reclaiming our sovereignty, I think we need to stop troops coming to Darwin, but they're coming during the midst of the coronavirus epidemic, when we know that quarantine is not perfect, is outrageous. If this virus gets into the Northern Territory and gets into the remote Aboriginal communities, it will decimate their elders and their culture. And I think it's outrageous these troops are still coming. It's outrageous in the first place, but even more so now. We need to renegotiate Pine Gap to be in Australian control and acting in Australian interests. We need to remove Australians from the chain of command in the Pacific. In domestic reforms, it's a long wish list, but I think we actually need electoral reform and have a more representative government, more like New Zealand or the German system. We need really to address the undue influence of the very powerful weapons industry, Murdoch media and others. And to do that, we need to tighten up our lobbying. The Auditor General came out with a scathing report saying that the promises the government had made to monitor lobbying was not working this week. We need to make our donations transparent with real-time reporting. Currently, more than half of donations in Australia are never reported. They go through third parties. We need an effective ICAC, unlike the hopeless proposal that's being proposed by the current government. We need to look to New Zealand, who has a minister for peace and disarmament, rather than Australia, where here we have shamefully a minister for defence industry, in other words, a minister for weapons manufacturer. And we actually need to have defence purchasing that focuses on defending Australia. I'm nearly finished. But the last thing I think we desperately need is war powers reform, because the current process just goes with the Prime Minister and the executive. In the US, the UK and a number of other countries, we need a debate and a vote on both houses of parliament before they can go to war, and that's what should be happening here. So just to conclude, there are many indirect costs to being tied to US foreign policy, direct costs and indirect costs. In health, education, foreign aid, there's social costs and there's political costs on our system. So I think we need to recognise the really powerful and pervasive military-industrial complex here in Australia. We need to recognise that ramping up defence spending not only damages other really important priorities for Australians, but also risks starting a regional arms race. We need to increase our diplomacy and develop multilateral alliances and support organisations like the United Nations. We need not to be tied to US domestic political decisions, and we need to have a foreign policy that focuses on Australia's long-term national interest and the real day-to-day security of Australians. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Margie. I'd like to introduce our third speaker, and following Denis, there will be the opportunity to ask questions. Beside me, I have Denis McNamara, who is a member of Spirit of Eureka in New South Wales. He is a rank and file delegate of the CFMEU, New South Wales branch. He was targeted by the ABCC, the Australian Building and Construction Commission. He was charged before Unfair Work Australia for refusing to remove a Eureka flag. With the CFMEU, he was a leader of the 2019 May Day strike and rally in Sydney. Welcome, Denis.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, comrades, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm going to touch on a few different issues, so yeah, forgive me if it seems like I drift around. I'm going to start with Pine Gap. It's been mentioned twice. On the 50th anniversary of the establishment of Pine Gap, an Ariente elder, Chris Tomlin, wrote in a letter, "It's not only Black Australia that has a sovereignty issue. The Ariente people have been the custodians and peaceful protectors of their country for thousands of years. Our sovereignty is contained in our songlines, stories and dances, which have been handed down over thousands of years. As the lawful custodians, we are responsible for what occurs on our land and the harm it brings to the rest of the world. The activity of the facility at Pine Gap has implicated us in criminal military actions, which threatens the dignity of all people, implicates us in war crimes and generates instability and conflict around the globe as a consequence of US imperialism. In 1788, the British colonised Australia through the brutal suppression and genocide of the first people of this land. Australia became an economic and political colony of the British Empire. And as Kim said earlier, after World War II, the British Empire declined and was replaced by the stronger US as the dominant foreign, economic, political and military power over Australia. And that continues today. The US-Australia alliance is a tool of US imperialism. I want to touch on workers' rights as well, because it's dear to my heart as a CFMEU delegate and union member. The Business Council of Australia and the Minerals Council represent interests of some of the biggest and most powerful global multinational corporations. Most of them are US based. Examples are ExxonMobil, Alcoa, Chevron, Boeing, Glencore, John Holland, Boral. In fact, Boral took our union on a few years ago in regards to enterprise agreement and the payment of site allowance on sites. And they took us to the Fair Work and the Federal Court. And their managing director flew out here from his office, his head office base in the US to give evidence against our union. Also the Longford ExxonMobil struggle. You know, Alcoa, Chevron, Woodside, they've all been spoken to about earlier. All US corporations driving the attacks on workers and unions in Australia. The Business Council of Australia and the Minerals Council instruct governments of the day on the anti-worker policies to protect and facilitate the exploitation and profit-making in Australia. The ABCC, the Integrity Bill, work choices, inquiry into trade unions, and we'll touch on the ABCC a little bit because it was mentioned in the start that, that I was taken to court by them to remove Eureka flags. So the ABCC, for people who don't understand, is a body that's set up and has no other powers other than in the construction industry. And they have separate powers, and we're under separate laws to every other person in Australia because we're construction workers. They don't investigate underpayment of super or wages or threats against workers. They don't investigate union officials being stopped to go onto jobs to carry out their lawful duties to make sure building sites are safe. Most of them are ex-federal coppers. They, when they do come on site, their first questions are, has the union been here? What did they say? What did people say at the meeting? And so forth. They have powers to interrogate normal working people. So we, under the law in Australia or their separate laws, these laws only apply to us. They have the power to take us in for interrogation. And if we refuse to answer their questions or don't answer them satisfactorily, there's only one penalty. And it's not a fine, it's not a good behaviour. There is one penalty that's been given against us, and that's 6 months jail. 6 months jail for refusing to answer questions of what happened at a building site, who said what at the meeting. So, it's a disgraceful thing that we put up with every day. And we don't allow them to dictate to us. We ignore them. Like it said, they took me to the commission to remove the flags. We didn't remove the flags, and we never will. That's part of the banning of the Eureka flags on building sites aimed to crush militant unions with a history of defending working people and to crush the fighting legacy of the Eureka Stockade Rebellion by Australia's working people. Like economically, key sections of Australia's economy are largely in the hands of foreign corporations, predominantly US owned. Mining and resources, banking and finance, media, construction and agriculture. They have great influence over compliant federal and state governments through, excuse me, I have to have a drink, sorry. Through their organisations and mouthpieces, the Business Council of Australia and the Minerals Council, and don't forget Murdoch's News Corporation. US corporations and finance are the biggest investors, owners and controllers of Australia's resources and the economy. The economic dominance and power by these corporations over Australia penetrates into all levels of Australian society, politically, economically, militarily, and culturally. Example, these corporations are the biggest tax evaders. The immense power of corporations over Australia's government ensures they pay little or no tax. ExxonMobil, Chevron, Rio Tinto, we could go on forever. Australia's Indigenous people continue to be not denied rights to ownership and control of their own lands. Australia's manufacturing industries have been decimated as a result of these multinationals' global imperialist policies, taking over Australia's industries and shifting them to other countries with cheaper labour and infrastructure costs, where the exploitation of workers is ruthless. Car manufacturing, steel fabrication, maritime and shipping industries, textile and clothing. Australia's manufacturing industries are replaced by weapons production owned and controlled by global multinational weapons manufacturing monopolies, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE, Boeing, Thales. Billions of people's taxes are siphoned away from people's needs to supporting US imperialist wars and multinational weapons manufacturing. Australia's defence and military are integrated into the US imperialist war machine that's been spoken about earlier as well. Australia's Navy, Air Force and Army are interoperable with the global US war machine and its military industrial complex. Australia is a US deputy sheriff, complying with US global military policies in the Asia Pacific, China and the South China Sea, the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Israel, Palestine. Australia's defence and military policies are mainly dictated to by the US to ensure that the US economic and military interests in Australia and globally are defended and promoted by Australian governments. US military and intelligence bases on Australian soil, Pine Gap, Northwest Cape, they've all been spoken about, and thousands of US Marines are now permanently stationed in Darwin, integrated into US military industrial complex. Political. 1975 political coup against the progressive Whitlam government, engineered by the US and Britain. Australian-American leadership dialogue grooms politicians, aspiring politicians and business people. Australia's economic defence and foreign policies largely protect and promote global and local US dominance. Foreign policies. Australian governments have unquestioningly followed and given support to every US war of aggression since World War II. Australia echoes US policies around the world. In the UN, Australia echoes and votes with the US, supporting and legitimising US aggressions, wars, occupations and sanctions against countries. US-Australia alliance is the main threat to Australia's peace and security. Workers and their families are the first casualties of war. Spirit of Eureka's vision for an independent Australia. Australia independent economically, politically, and militarily from all big powers. Economic independence for us means public ownership of Australia's minerals and energy resources and major banks, use of the profits for people's needs. Build self-reliant and sustainable value-added and manufacturing industries. Profits put into people's social needs. Government-owned sovereign self-defence manufacturing industries for defence, not offensive wars. Transition the economy away from fossil fuel industries. Instead, invest in developing environmentally sustainable resource and manufacturing industries. Billions of people's taxes are spent on US wars and support for multinational weapons manufacturers instead of being directed to public health and education, which the previous speaker spoke in depth about, and raise welfare benefits and social and community needs. Political independence means upholding the sovereignty of Australia in making decisions on what is in the best interest of the Australian people, and reject any interference or influence in Australia's political life by any foreign power, whether it be US or Chinese, and an independent foreign policy. Independent foreign policy that promotes global peace, sovereignty of countries, and builds friendship with people of the world. We say no foreign bases and troops on Australian soil and end the US-Australia alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis. I'm going to hand over to our moderator for questions now. We've already received a number of questions, so I'm going to hand over to Derek.
Okay, thank you, Kim. My name is Derek Burke. I'm facilitating the Q&A for this webinar. At the bottom of your Zoom page, you'll see a Q&A button. Click on it, then type in your question, and don't forget to press enter. Please state which of our panellists you are directing your question to. In addition to the Q&A, there is a chat button, and if you'd like to make a comment about the discussion, please enter it here. Now, the first question I have is for Clinton. Clinton, when Australian Navy ships accompany US Navy ships in the South China Sea, who has operational command?
The captain of each ship has command of their own ship, and the mission is agreed on in advance, and it's under the control of the fleet. But the rules of engagement are all decided before any Australian ship leaves port.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is also for you, Clinton. How has the possibility of genuine defence of Australia been compromised by the military dependence on and interoperability with the US?
Australia remains an extremely secure country, and the point of the defence or the interoperability isn't to defend the territory of Australia, but to uphold an imperial system. If I could explain with an example, the reason the US has such a huge military budget is that it is a way to fund high-tech industry. The reason we are using computers and iPhones and everything else is that these were all developed at public expense through the Department of Defense. And in that sense, it's not so much wastage as a subsidy from the American public to the United States. When it comes to eating healthily, everybody gets told all the time, have a variety of foods and do all kinds of free range type of foods and organic stuff. Well, that can only happen if you force peasants in the third world to grow stuff for export to us rather than to feed themselves primarily. Australia is not suffering from this system. The cost is being borne by the global south. For example, the gas tank of just a petrol tank of a mid-sized car, say 50 liters, okay? If you use bioethanol on it, which is what the big thing is, we're trying to get off fossil fuels, let's use bioethanol. It takes 358 kilos of corn to destroy that. A child in Mexico or Zambia can live off that for a whole year. Now, the reason you have food crises and food shortages is that the international system makes the people in the global south grow stuff for export to us rather than principally to feed themselves. We are not suffering from the system. They are. And if they were given a choice, they would migrate to Australia to take advantage of our sub-imperial status. And so that's the real cost. It's not us. It's the global south. And that imperial system is upheld by a range of actors, including covert operations, intelligence, manipulation of elections, coups d'etat, in order to put in place people and leaders in the global south who can ensure that system continues. And our operations are designed for exactly the same purpose. It is not right to say that we are somehow suffering or being immiserated by that system. Rather, it is the global south that is the principal sufferer from the system, not us.
Okay, thank you.
The question of interoperability doesn't even arise.
Yeah, okay. The next question I have is for both Margie and Clinton. What should the priorities be for Australia to have an independent foreign policy? Would you like to begin, Margie?
The The wish list I gave in my talk is very long. If I was going to start, I would be probably looking at the political processes and the media. So I think we need, I think we really need to clean up what's happening in Canberra. It would be wonderful to have a much more representative parliament. The current political voting system is affected, well, it's very rigged towards the two major parties. It's not representative. We don't have sufficient regulation over lobbying. The distortion of priorities is so great that it's in many, many areas. But I suppose I would change the electoral system. I would look at lobbying and donations so that you get public policy that's in the public interest instead of the interests of vested interests. And if I was allowed a third thing, I'd also have war powers reform. But there are many other, it's a very complex interwoven system, and the weapons companies are historically one of the most corrupt industries globally for decades. And I have no doubt that there is a lot happening that is needs cleaning up. I also think that the training of young politicians to go to America and become part of the American system before they even become prominent. There are many, many budding politicians that go on these scholarships or fellowships or whatever to America to educate them, in inverted commas. I think we really need to have a better electoral system so we can have a more balanced representation, more like what we see in New Zealand or Germany.
Now, would you like to comment on that question, Clinton? Would you like me to repeat the question?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
The principal thing that needs to happen in the first place is education and organizing of our own society, rather than expect people in power to make all these changes. Otherwise, it reads like a letter to Santa Claus. And in so doing, in trying to educate and organize our own society, which includes ourselves, we have to make common cause with popular organizations rather than states around the world, including and especially in the global south. The largest network of peasants, for example, has its international headquarters in Indonesia, La Via Campesina. The most important humanitarian organization in the world is the World Food Programme. The average Australian, including many activists, have no understanding of this. Many of the proposals read like a progressive version of Australia Firstism. And so in the first instance, we would need to have make common cause with people in the global south and understand how their needs fit into and are being suppressed by the imperial system of which we are a part.
Thank you, Clinton. And the next question is for Denis and Clinton. We'll start with you, Denis.
Yep.
The question is, with the US ownership and shareholding controlling so many of Australia's biggest companies, could a future Australian government nationalise key resources such as mining and banking to keep wealth in Australia?
Yeah, well, I believe a future government, if brave enough, could not only nationalise all industries. And that's something that we should be talking about. We never speak about the wealth of the country belonging to all of us. Our country is owned by, as we spoke today, US, but other imperialist countries, our mines. So all that profit of those mines, those oil, everything else goes out of the country. And the banking industry. There would be nothing stopping any government to legislate and nationalise all key industries to ensure, you know, and then the profit from that go back to the Australian people instead of to the boardrooms of foreign companies. So yeah, my answer, yes.
Clinton?
You'll have to repeat the question. Could
Sure.
you please repeat the question?
Certainly.
Just quickly.
Yep. With US ownership and shareholding controlling so many of Australia's biggest companies, could a future Australian government nationalise key resources such as mining and banking to keep wealth in Australia?
There is The only obstacle, the only legal or political obstacle to nationalizing is Section 51, subsection 31 of the Constitution, where compensation has to be made on just terms, but it's actually a state power. The state can, in fact, take property, provided it gives compensation on just terms. The will to do so is, of course, another matter altogether. But once again, it doesn't make sense to think about changing the system when clearly for the majority of the public, as you can see from the opinion polls, they find that it actually works very well and it's beneficial. It's only if they were provided with information about what it means for the world as a whole and how our wealth is based on the super exploitation of others, that they can then make an ethical choice with the right information. Otherwise, I just can't see any political will being assembled.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question I have, I'll leave it open to all to answer because the person hasn't nominated anybody in particular. Anyway, how worried are you that Trump may win the November election based on an anti-China rhetoric? How do you see this scenario affecting Australia? And could public opinion finally shift as regards ANZUS? Margie, would you like to answer that one?
I think politicians often use going to war to increase their popularity. I think Donald Trump is desperate to distract the American public from the catastrophe that is coronavirus in America. And fear drives people in ways that you don't expect. So I am certainly concerned that Donald Trump may try to use the sort of well-known rally around the flag effect, where in times of warfare, the incumbent vote goes up. I think it's a question to watch this space. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm concerned.
Denis, would you like to comment?
Yeah, look, I'm worried about him getting elected, of course. Whether I believe it would change the or have an effect on public opinion in Australia is another matter. I think the only thing that will have an effect on public opinion is education of the working class and the masses, which is done at the moment by the media, which is foreign owned, and the whole time that they're portraying that he's the best person for the job and that Australia needs to be as close to the Yanks as we can, yeah, the public opinion won't change. But I think forums like this and being out in your workplace and talking to people and in your communities and getting people to actually have a look at what is actually going on and start to question things rather than just believe everything they're told will go towards it. But yeah, I don't have any belief that just because he gets elected, people's public opinion in Australia will change.
Clinton, would you like to comment?
Yeah, for about 40 years, there have been very good predicting indices about who wins a presidential election. The opinion poll rating in the lead up to summer, before an election, the North American summer, the performance of the economy, and the amount of donations that you receive. That's the most accurate predictor of who will win an election. Based on those indicators, the incumbent cannot win. It looks very likely that, or not cannot, nothing's impossible, but based on those indicators, a win is unlikely. The question of who becomes president, in a way, is it's the big corporations' call. It isn't something that activists should be too concerned about because it's just too powerful. If you want a presidential election, if you're an American, and I'm not, a presidential election for most people who consider themselves activists would be a 5-minute decision. Who are you voting against? Not who are you voting for. Who are you voting against? And then you move on to the more serious organizing around issues, whether it's Medicare for all or whatever else it happens to be, equitable funding in education and health in Australia, for example, rather than try and get behind one or another election candidate. That's just the big end of town's call. It's not our business. We can't affect that.
Thank you, Clinton. Next question is for you, Margie. What do you think the impact of the Korean War was on Australia?
I have to confess it's not an area that I've studied. I know more about Iraq and Vietnam and a little about Afghanistan, so I would prefer not to comment on that.
Okay, all right, moving along. Next question
Just a second, I've covered that in the book. It was responsible for the major economic boom in the 1950s, Australia.
Thank you, Clinton. Next question is for you, Denis. It says, I'm wondering if Denis could comment on why so many Australians are fearing China, but unquestioning about the national security risks involved in Australia's unquestioning US alliance.
Yeah, okay, so my comment would be that media control has a huge influence. If we look at Australia's media, it's run by two families, and the most prominent media in our country is Murdoch's media, who has been a US citizen now for years, but also to government scaremongering. So fear is a huge weapon, and if put in the hands of people in political power, can have huge impacts on average people. So in regards to the US, we're always told that we need them to protect us. I hear it at work all the time. If we're not involved with the US, Indonesia will invade. If we're not involved with the US, China will take over. So this is all done through media and through governments to back up, their belief and their close links with the US. But I disagree. But like I said, I just wanted to really emphasize how big a weapon fear is. I saw something the other day that said it showed fear, and it was a herd of sheep, and said, why do they all fear? Why do they all run around, hundreds of sheep with one little dog behind them? And that's because they were fearful. Each individual was fearful. If they all united and got together, they could turn around and kill the dog quite easily, but they fear it. So that's the powerful emotion that gets put into lots of us to make us compliant.
Actually, I might open that question to the other two speakers. Margie, would you like to comment?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Could you comment on why so many Australians are fearing China, but unquestioning about the national security risks involved in Australia's unquestioning US alliance?
I think there's been deep-seated prejudice against Asians in Australia for a very long time. I think Clinton's right, education and the media are key to having a more analytical populace. I think you can sort of, in some ways, it's due to manipulation. I think that people don't recognize the huge corporate machine that lies behind a lot of political decision-making in Australia. So why they don't question America, I think culturally we're similar. I think we have a lot of television and they sort of feel that they understand, they're comfortable with the Americans. I think this title, Fear of Abandonment, of that Allen Gingell book is exactly the Australian psyche, that it's time we grew up and recognized that we can defend ourselves. We have allies, but we don't need to trot off after America to each of its wars, and it would be a tragedy if we get dragged into a war between America and China.
Thank you, Margie. Clinton, would you like to comment?
As to why there's this fear of China rather than the cost. Well, the fear of China begins in the 1850s, the gold rush on the gold fields. And there are plenty of other reasons. The best analysis is, once again, in Caroline Yarnell's PhD thesis, which goes to, I just want to bring up this key point here. If I could just share this slide. let me see if I can bring this up. I beg your pardon. Share. How do I share this, my screen? Okay, got it. Here. All right. It is responsive. It's influenced by triggers. The external events have not actually caused that much of a cost to Australia. There have been diggers that have occasionally come back broken and so on, but you know, the society as a whole hasn't suffered. Meanwhile, considerable benefits have accrued to the Australian public as a result of the umbrella of American power, which we uphold in our region and in the wider region. And public opinion is coherent and consistent. It shows a degree of structure and discernment. Any activist has to start with what does the public actually think, and have some respect for that. And the reason we fear China is that there have been a lot of discussion about the hostile nature. The view of China and the trust in China has sharply decreased in 2020, partly as a result of the origin of the coronavirus, but in large part due to the steady drumbeat of warnings about threats. It is what you'd expect the public to react to. That's basically the answer.
Thank you, Clinton. Next question. It's for you, Clinton. In relation to the South China West Philippine Sea dispute, how should we relate to the Philippine National Democratic Movement's rejection of China's incursion into what they claim is rightfully Philippine territory?
We should be more interested in hearing their views, definitely. I think that we should be reaching out to some of these civil society organizations and mass peasant organizations, as well as urban workers organizations. These things were actually happening in the 1990s. There was a previous September 11, it was called S11, it was in Melbourne in September 11, 2000. And the whole thing went away after the invasion of Iraq, September 11 terrorist attacks. The activist energy went into the anti-war campaign rather than into a campaign about the empire and capitalist imperialism, which totally transforms other societies, I beg your pardon. I just want to add something here, which is this national democratic movement you're talking about. We should be quite careful about some of the claims that are made, because it's not just China that is disregarding and exempting itself from the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice on maritime boundary matters. China is doing that, but there's another country that exempts itself from international law by withdrawing from the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. That country is my country, Australia. When it came to Timor-Leste, 3 months before Timor became an independent state, we withdrew from the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice so that Timor could not exercise its rights under international law. That is also a rogue state. And so, yes, the Philippines and the National Democratic Movement are right, and we should be listening to them. But there's a chance to transform our own society. And that's where I come out on this.
Thank you, Clint. Now, the next question I've got, it's a very long question. I'm going to have to abridge it. It's about USA-Australia cultural colonisation, mind control. It's kind of a Noam Chomsky manufacturing consent type question. And here we go. Examples of US cultural colonisation of Australia include, in the early and mid-20th century, the deliberate takeover of the Australian film, TV, music industries. During the Cold War time, many US spy shows depicted US good guys defeating the Russian bad guys. This subsequently morphed into US dominated internet, including US owned social media and computer games, made to be addictive, which promulgate and normalise violence and war as a solution to defeating the bad guys. The resulting cultural domination is so pervasive and normalised that many Australian citizens accept without question the American contextualisation of their lives, including, for example, knowing more about America than Australian history and geography. So it's about US cultural colonisation of our minds. I'll open up to you, Margie. Would you like to comment?
Yes, I think that really in terms of combating this, again, it comes back to education. We need to fund education so people develop critical analysis of what's happening in their lives. I think we have got an enormous amount of American cultural input. Institutions like SBS, where you actually see what's happening in the world in places other than America, is an absolute national treasure. And again, to have this government cutting the funding of the ABC and cutting the funding of SBS is terrible. But I think, again, education, a more balanced media, the weakening of the watering down of the media ownership laws has also contributed to this cultural dominance. So there's sort of many factors in it, and I think we need to go back to basics and try and improve the public education system and funding institutions that hold the government to account and present a balanced picture.
Thank you, Margie. Denis, would you like to comment?
Yeah, look, I've struggled for years with US culture dominating Australia, and it does. And a lot of it's done through the television and the films, like the person asking the question. And you have to remember too that years ago we used to have local content quotas for our television shows and for our media, which we had to have a certain percentage of Australian programs shown on our television. That's what it was like when I was growing up. So you saw Australian film, you saw culture here, but now that's all gone. So we now see our films, and that's if anyone watches TV, they all do Netflix or whatever else nowadays, but all of that is heavily US influenced. And it does create that acceptance that their culture is stronger or better or what we should aspire to. And I agree with the questioner on the comment of the games and that industry. It normalises those things for our children or for the young people, that this is the normal thing. And yeah, and I think it's very, very dangerous.
Clinton, would you like to comment, please?
No, nothing for me, thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay, the next question, it's a bit of a repeat, I think, but I'll ask it anyway. This is for you, Clinton. Can Australian government decide foreign policy without US intervention?
Yes, it's under the Constitution. Section 61 deals with the executive power, and the power to deploy troops is believed to fit within Section 61. It's just part of executive power. There's no constitutional objection or obstacle to acting independently. It's just that it doesn't make sense to act independently when you are part of a bigger empire, and that empire and its prosperity in a way underwrites your own.
Thank you, Clinton. The next question is for you, Margie. It's a bit of a lengthy one. We have been unable to win equitable funding in education and health now. These kinds jumped away from me. Where'd it go? So it's run away from me. So, and I can't seem to get it back. I'm going to have to move to another question. The next question is to Denis. Sorry about that, Margie. I just it disappeared. Within the union movement, is there any understanding of Australia's economic sub-imperial role and willingness to support the exploited South? I am a union councillor and put a motion along these lines recently to my national union meeting and failed to get a seconder. During the Work Choices campaign in the mid-2000s, there was also very little support within the Victorian union movement.
Okay. Look, there's a small understanding but not much. We've got a lot of work to do within the union movement, but also across the whole of society to broaden people's understanding of politics. Australia's a very apathetic people, or I found. They just, everything's okay, and we've been taught all that for a long time. I'm all right, Jack. You live in the lucky country. Everything's all right. You'll be okay. Don't worry about it. And so I think a lot of people don't question what's actually going on. But I think I can't understand why he wouldn't get a seconder on it. But in the mid-2000s, there was already I think that's just something that as progressive people, we need to push and try and educate.
Thanks, Dennis. The next question, it's open to all three. Should foreign aid be seen as a part of sub-imperialism role that we play? Should we see it as a progressive move? Margie suggested in her presentation, pacify and suppress discontent. I'll start with you, Margie.
I think it depends how the foreign aid is given and what the programs are and to whom they benefit. I think, for example, there was a terrific aid program that has been subsequently scrapped due to cuts in Africa, which in one of the African nations where 750,000 people got vaccinations, basic healthcare, clean water and sanitation. And I think a program like that, where you actually are genuinely helping people who otherwise would be in enormous humanitarian distress, is constructive. I think there are programs that can build and support societies. I think there are programs that can provide infrastructure that may or may not be useful, but may be done through debt instruments. There's many different ways to use foreign aid, and I think it's actually a matter of looking at it in terms of positive developments to try and increase the ability of communities to survive and thrive. But it's a complicated area, and one of the reasons why I think defunding DFAT, as well as reducing foreign aid, is really damaged the ability of our foreign aid to be constructive. So I think it's a mixed picture, and I think it's how you do it.
Thank you, Margie. Clinton, would you like to comment?
Well, the chapter in the book that deals with foreign aid, and we haven't got much time, but the purpose of aid is the same as the purpose of our diplomacy, as our defense posture, as every other aspect of statecraft. The purpose of foreign aid is to exert control. That it doesn't have to be, but that's the way it is. Here's an example. This is once again the Global South, not very well known. The Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavare, wanted to build an undersea cable connecting his country to the rest of the world, to Guam and so on, and then on to the mainland of the United States and to Australia, in order to get internet access. He chose a Chinese firm because it was, he believed, or says he believed, best value for money. The head of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service was reported to have flown to the Solomon Islands, threatened him not to do that. When he persisted, there was a parliamentary vote of no confidence because of our strong control and influence in that parliament. He was removed as prime minister. His successor announced that they were not going to go with a Chinese firm, and then the entire cable was funded by our foreign aid budget. When we bugged the cabinet offices in Timor, we did it by using the foreign aid budget as part of refurbishing and helping to reconstruct Timor. Foreign aid is handled in exactly the same way as the other instruments of statecraft, because it's the same people who are handling that. And that aspect is not known. No. It could, though. I mean, this is the whole point of what Dr. Yarnell's thesis is saying, that if the public are given relevant information in a timely fashion, then they will change their mind because they are responsive to the right cues.
Yeah, it's quite appalling, Clinton. Thank you. How much time we got left? I think we're just about running out of time now. Is that right, Kim?
Yeah, it's 10 to 6, so I think we were due to finish.
Yeah.
5:30.
My apologies to all the other people sending questions. Some very good questions, but we've just run out of time. Thank you very much. Back to you, Kim.
Okay, thank you to all of our speakers. Thanks, Derek, for moderating those questions. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in this topic about what could we do to achieve Australian independence. I think Clinton's points about us being a very well active and engaged junior partner in US imperialism is a really important point for us to take on board. And the fact that we actually actively benefit from that relationship and have done so for a very long time, even though many of our people do not benefit, as do many Americans who do not benefit from having 60% of their budget spent on military spending in complete opposition to any other needful spending in the US. I think the current decline of the US is going to be very interesting to watch when Americans become sicker and sicker and the economy hurtles towards the crash that is so obviously coming. And that's the sort of event that could change public opinion in Australia. I think Margie's point about what $5 billion can achieve if it was diverted from military spending to real spending that benefits people is a pretty shocking example of what's been going in the wrong direction for a very long time. Obviously, the same can be said of foreign aid in our region. If we really wanted to play a peaceful role in the Pacific, there are a lot of useful things that we could achieve by diverting our military spending to foreign aid spending. The US is totally directing our activities on that front, and we are a true comprador nation, and we have to actually accept that truth. Most Australians don't understand what that term means, or that there is any deficit to us being a comprador nation. Denis's point that you know, the BCA and most of the top 20 companies in Australia are very good representatives of US interests in Australia, and they see anyone they identify as their enemy as someone that should be punished severely for any sort of opposition, and that's why they oppose his union in particular, but those workers in those industries standing up for their own rights in any way. The last point I'd like to make is I think we've got a lot of lessons to learn from campaigns that have actually changed public opinion in Australia and in our region. The anti-nuclear campaign is a really good example. We have not achieved nuclear power in Australia, and we do not engage in the nuclear weapons cycle as such. We certainly assist the US in their rolling out of that, but Australians are opposed to nuclear power as a majority. I think the Black Lives Matter and the whole shift that's going to occur now around understanding the truth about Aboriginal Australia is going to affect real change for all of us. And there is popular shifting of opinion, particularly amongst young people around that story. They don't want the old story. They want to hear the truth, and they want a future that is peaceful and reconciled. I think there are other campaigns which we could look at that have successfully changed public opinion. And I know certainly the campaign around recognition of Palestine is a very good example of a campaign that's been waged over 10 years now, but has significantly turned public opinion around about Israel and Palestine, and is a good example of how to conduct really solid lobbying of political interests to get them to shift their opinions around those matters. We have a lot of work to do, as Denis said, and our education system does not tell us these truths about Australia. So, you know, we have a lot to do in terms of turning that ship around, and we don't own our media in any way, shape or form anymore. But we certainly, young people don't listen to that media. We still read newspapers and radio, and perhaps some of us even observe, you know, mainstream TV. Most of the younger generation do not, and they go looking for other sources for their information. We need to be in those spaces and influencing the thinking in those spaces. If you'd like to follow what occurred during the broadcast today, you can refer back to our Facebook page. And yes, this was recorded and will be available through the Facebook page. I presume that Spirit of Eureka will be holding further webinars. I think this went quite well, minus a few hiccups. And I'd really like to thank all three speakers for making their time available on a Saturday afternoon, and for their enormously informed and interesting presentations. Thanks very much to all three of you. Thank
Kim,
you.
just before you sign off, I'd just like to point out to our audience that this webinar has been recorded and will be placed on Facebook and on our Spirit of Eureka website.
Thanks, Derek.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening and thanks for participating. Bye-bye.
Thank you.